Welcome, everyone. My name is Julene Jackson. I'm with Moms for America, the National Vice President over Cottage Meetings. So glad to have all you beautiful mamas and grandmas from around the country join us today. We are in seminar number 13, or number 11 out of the 16 lessons of our Healing of America seminar. And girls, you are a part of Cottage Meeting. If you've ever wondered what a cottage meeting looks like, we're doing an online cottage meeting. So it's a little different than if you would meet with a couple of women in your home. You'd certainly have a lot more back and forth participation, but you're kind of getting the idea of women gathering together and kind of feeling the spirit of the material that we're learning and having your heart pricked, and God kind of speaks something to your mind and your heart about what you might be able to do within your family or community. And so I congratulate you. So anyways, all right, girls, we are on seminar 3. I hope this seminar has not driven you to the closet with a tub or a gallon or something, a chocolate bar of ice cream or something. I know it's kind of heavy duty, all the problems that have helped us become unhinged, hanging off the hinges here. But, you know, we have to know, I always say this, we have to know the problems and how it got broke in order to be able to have the tools to repair and to restore and to heal this nation. I love that seminar 1. Remember, girls, if you're just starting for some reason today, you can go back and watch all the past presentations that we've had up until this point. They're all on our Moms for America website, seminar 1 and seminar 2, all the classes. You can buy the little manuals. For some reason, I just only have seminar 3 manual. They're $12 a piece on our Moms for America store. You fill in the blank. The whole idea is when you use multiple sensories of listening, hearing, writing, you actually retain and you remember more. And if you will go back 48 hours after you've learned something and review that material, you will have a 50% higher rate of retention. And so these are just little tips that we give and have you fill in the blanks so that you will remember and retain what we're learning here. But that first seminar, God's Hand in Building America, reminds us God is a God of miracles. So when you watch the news and you look around what's going on in your neighborhoods and school systems, and you begin to think we're going to heck in a handbag, remember, God is a God of miracles, and think back of those stories and his hand in building America when we should have not even, you know, he used a little 14-year-old girl in France, and then Christopher Columbus, and then that Revolutionary War. We were up against the greatest army and navy in the world, and our little ragtag army of farmers won. So don't lose hope. And then seminar 2, we studied, you're practically constitutional scholars. I mean, I dare say you know more about the Constitution, 7 articles, 27 amendments, a little bit about what they're about. Legislature is our acronym to remember our articles. So we want to understand the wisdom of the founding fathers so we can detect when we are off, when laws are off, when sentiment is off. When we read the headlines in the newspaper, we will know, wait a minute, that's not rooted in our founding principles that made America great. And now we're learning about in seminar 3, the attacks on America. How have we gotten in the mess in the boat that we are? We've talked about, you know, education, how they took God out of education, and attacks on the moral fiber of this country. We're a God-fearing country. When you take God and religion off the table, it impacts the way this government that was founded on people's law, God's law, it affects our ability to maintain and keep this republic strong. And today we're going to talk about the assaults on the Charter of Freedom, the attacks on the Constitution. Now, some of this should sound kind of familiar because we talked about some of these amendments that have come since our founding fathers, you know, exited the scene. We got amendments 13 through 27 after our founding fathers, and it has impacted and changed some of the existing amendment. Every time you add an amendment to the Constitution, it supersedes or changes that existing law that our founders gave us. And we're going to talk about some of the attacks on the Constitution. So girls, you know, we talk about these things not to lose hope, but to know that, you know, when we understand how we got here, we understand how to heal. And so you might say, it feels like we're at war for the hearts of our children and for our communities and nations. But I always love this idea: don't take fear or don't take counsel from your fears. God has said, I've not given you the spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a strong mind. Okay, so it's within us to rise up and to kind of fresh courage take, because our God, we know, is a mighty God. And as long as we stay on his side and we stay anchored in hope. Now, one of the ways we stay anchored in hope sometimes means we're going to have to stand up and push back a little bit with some of the things that are going on. I had the wonderful opportunity to go with 3 other Moms for Americas, and 2 of those moms are on the call today: Vivian Brown, our wonderful executive assistant for Moms for America, and Samantha Hall, who is a mom just like you all, that just started taking these Healing of America classes, but she is going to run for the school board in Pennsylvania. And we all went to this conference in Nashville Friday through Sunday, talking about education and how to effectively run for school boards. And we had state legislators and people that had served on school boards and all kind of wonderful activists and people that love America and love freedom speak to us. So I've asked Samantha, where are you, Samantha, to give us just a little heads up about what that was this weekend and why in the world you've decided, you've mustered up the courage, because that's what it takes to do what you're doing, running for school board in your community in Pennsylvania. Take it away, Samantha.
Well, thank you, Julene. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I just want to say that meeting Julene and Vivian is exactly as you see them on these webinars. They are wonderful people and they made me feel so at home. And I have to be honest, I was a little scared to do this, but they just made me feel so comfortable. I wanted to just show you this picture. This is my grandfather, and he was a survivor out Pearl Harbor. And my grandfather instilled in me a great love of my country, but I didn't really know why I loved my country. I just knew that it was a great place to be. And I think that Julene and everything that they're doing with Mothers for America are just helping me really to get into those stories. And so I've been involved with Moms for America for a while, and it so happened that in one of the first sessions, Julene said, you might not know why you're here, but you might get called on by God to, do something. And I had never entertained the idea of running for school board. I just hadn't. And within a few weeks of taking this seminar, I received a call from somebody that said, hey, we've got 4 seats open on the school board. Would you be willing to run for one? And I really had to pray about that because it felt like a really big leap. But I kept praying and I kept talking to people and the doors kept opening. And so I just kind of one step at a time, just kept going through those doors. And as I was going through these meetings, Vivian at one point said that there was going to be this school board training and it was going to be in Nashville. And I thought, oh my goodness, that is such a big thing to do. And I inquired about it, but I thought, I don't know if I can do this. And so I was literally in chapel one day and I was getting ready to send the email to both Julene and Vivian to say, thank you so much for this opportunity, but I have just got too much going on at home, my kids, and there's driving school and all these things. And I was getting ready to hit send, and I asked the Lord to anoint my words because I wanted them to know how appreciative I was. And literally at that moment, Julene texted me and she's like, hey, are you going to go? Have you found out any information about it? And just like that, I knew that that's where God wanted me to be. And so it was a phenomenal experience. And I just really wanted to share with you a couple things that I heard. I'm sorry, my dog's hearing my bark. But I just wanted to share with you a couple things I heard that I thought were of note. So there was a presentation from Jane Robbins. She was the one that I followed during Common Core. And she spoke about woke education. And there were things in here that I knew about, and there were things in here that I didn't know about. And I thought as moms and grandmas and people that are in your community, I would just share really quickly a couple things that she talked about to put this on your radar. So the first thing that she talked about was this whole idea of equality versus equity. And I feel that most of us know about that. It sounds like a good thing, but we really need to kind of check into that. So kind of put that down when you start to hear that equity word, ask about that. The other thing that she said that I didn't even know is that many schools are suspending advanced learning opportunities because they feel that they create inequitable incomes. Now, they have suspended advanced learning at our school, but they've done it under the guise of COVID. And that may be true or it may not be true, but I certainly know to ask that. The other thing that they talked about that I thought was interesting, and I did not know about this, beware of action civics. I think this is, again, another word, civics, that we all have a positive association with. Action Civics, there's a curriculum that is founded by Sandra Day O'Connor, which again seems good, and Arnie Duncan. And if you remember, he was very much associated with Common Core, and it's called iCivics. So be very aware if civics is coming into your school, don't just take for granted that it is something that we have an association with, but really understand it. And it's basically advocacy within the school, but never really advocate for the right-leaning causes. Let's see, what was the other thing? Oh, social emotional learning. I have to say we have that at my school. I really didn't know that much about it, but they see that as something that can have sort of, some different goals and objectives to it. So again, just ask questions. Restorative justice. This was interesting. There was a young man that spoke about school resource safety officers and about how integral they are to schools, especially schools that are in lower income areas. And they are looking at taking out those school resource officers and putting in restorative justice, which keeps those kids in the classroom, but without any relationships or being able to help build them up or form them. So that's on the lookout. And parenthood, I think we all know that they are in the schools. And so what are solutions? So Jane offered 3 solutions. She said, you must work at the local level. You must make sure that your local school board, that those members understand what's going on. And as I told Julene, when I was discerning starting for school board, I spoke with a board member that I respect very much, but he said to me in kind, that, we are the school board and our authority is there, but we trust school because they're the experts. And we just have to check that because we are the experts of our children. So again, it came from a very genuine place in him. I understand what he's saying. We are experts too. There should not be that wall between educators and parents. So make sure you know what's going on at the school board. Make sure you're talking to your school board. Make sure you are educating your state senators and your reps and let them know what is going on, engage them. And then the third thing is to make sure that you are talking and understanding the State Board of Education, because a lot of times those directives, as we learned, come from the State Board of Education. So those were the highlights of this event. It was phenomenal. I'd love to talk about it forever, but I thought those would be the things that might be most pertinent to this audience this morning. So thank you, Julene.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Samantha. And you said something in the beginning that I think applies to all of us. Just a few months ago, you had no intention of running for the school board, that you didn't have time, you didn't have the desire, or whatever was holding you back, no way. But God got a hold of your heart as you start to learn and study and seek some solutions. And this opportunity presented itself, and you said, okay, Lord, here am I, send me, I guess, fearing and trepidation. Just like Becky Flannery, a mom from Idaho I was talking to before we started, when COVID hit, she had to, kind of homeschool in the spring, and she thought, there's no way in heck I would ever homeschool. This is too overwhelming. But something happened over the course of the summer to change her mind, and now she's successfully homeschooling a brutal little kids at home. So sometimes girls, we think of things that other people are doing and we're like, oh no, I couldn't do that. I'm not qualified. I don't know enough. I don't have enough time. I don't have the interest. And as we keep seeking God and seeking his word and seeking these principles that made America great, God will weigh on our heart and opportunities will present themselves. And you will have the opportunity to say, okay, Lord, send me. You got to help me though. And that's kind of how it was when I became involved with Moms for America. And I got a phone call to be a vice president of this national organization. I listed all the reasons why I couldn't do it. And then the Spirit, right as I was talking to our national president, I thought it's almost like he said to me, Julene, if you aren't willing to stand on this wall and talk about cottage meetings, something that you have a witness of, who will do this, Julene, if you won't? And so on the spot, I had a change of heart. And so I really commend you for showing up each week, because God is going to impress something upon your heart and mind that you can do to shore up, even if it's just within the four walls of your home, something you can be doing differently with your children or grandchildren. So, okay, let's get going. So we know how the John Dewey, boo, Horace Mann, boo. Now I hope you know those names. They're not good dudes. They're anti-God. They knew, particularly Dewey, if he could remove mama and God from a child's life, then they could move in and begin the process of indoctrination. So they took this little one-room schoolhouse that we had in the 1800s and 1900s, separated the kids, isolated them from big brother and little sister, and now made peer pressure more important in the life of that child than family, and implanted in the children's mind, oh, there's a generation gap. Mom and dad, they're old-fashioned. Their ideals are, we got to progress. We got to move forward. And so our founders knew that people behave according to how they believe and what they know. And so they knew in the school systems, they had to teach these principles that made this Constitution so unique to America. And if we didn't continue to teach the constitutional principles of a republic, we would eventually use it. Remember, our founders wanted not only knowledge taught in the schools, but religion and morality. Now, that's a radical idea, because this republic was based on people's law. We have anarchy on one side, tyranny on the other, and people's law right in the balance center. But people had to remain morally strong and virtuous to be able to maintain this form of self-government. And this is why they knew we needed morality and religion. And so when we began to, in the 1900s, take prayer and scripture out of schools, what creeps in? Anti-God things. And look, we're dealing with that crazy 1619 critical race theory now, complete opposite of what the founders would have intended for the children to be taught. So the question is, in the very first page on section 3, sorry, I'm not sure if I said that, we are in section 3 of seminar 3. The question is, who in the world has been tampering with the soul of America? Who is to blame? We're always wanting to point, who's the blame here? Well, don't let this offend you, girls, but maybe we're part of the blame. If you want to find the devil who is responsible for our becoming more socialistic, go home and look in the mirror. We are all responsible. If Washington has been making us more socialist, it's because we as citizens have been asking Washington to do so. Not only the citizens, but big corporations, banks, farm lobbies, labor, the Federal Reserve System, the education system, big, little cities, a multitude of special interest groups have all been trying to get something from the Constitution and the free enterprise system that really is strictly forbidden. So instead of our laws being based on all power in the people, it's now based on kind of ruler's law. Whoever controls the money rules. And so this has been going on for about the last 100 years. So really the first 100 years after our Constitution, remember, we went from only having 6% of the world's population to producing over 50% of the world's wealth, with these ideas of limited government and checks and balances and prosperity economics. And then socialistic anti-God reforms, and people started easing in. And over the last 100 years, we've seen real attacks on the Constitution, on the founders, on the form of government that we have. Right off, we've talked about it in seminar 2, how the 16th Amendment that was passed in 1913 imposed a federal tax. Up until that point, our founders intended for us to all be taxed uniformly and fairly. And it says that in the first article of the Constitution, that states were to determine how to get the tax money for the federal budget. So this is how it was supposed to work. If your state was 3% of the total population of the country, you were responsible for 3% of the federal budget. And so your state, your governor, the state legislator, it was up to them to determine how they were going to come up with their little piece of the federal budget. They could use resources, they could tax. It was up to the states' rights. But with the 16th Amendment, it said that the federal government can now come into your home directly and tax you. And so what happened is it grew the federal government to be nice and fat. And then they wanted to get creative with all this money they were taking in, and they came up with all kind of programs. So instead of looking at the local level or our states to figure out how to provide for the poor and the needy or to educate our children, everyone started looking to Washington, D.C., 3,000 miles away, to tell us how to educate our children. And really, that 16th Amendment put us on the road to socialism, government controlling more and more aspects of our life. So that's the 16th Amendment. And then we saw the 17th Amendment, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that the 17th Amendment really weakened our state legislature and the protection of the states' rights when we passed that 17th Amendment. The 16th and the 17th Amendment both were passed in 1913 and completely, I want to say, almost destroyed the proper checks and balances of the federal government and the state. There was that senator that stood on that wall and represented the state to Washington, D.C., but that was disrupted by the passage of the 17th Amendment. And then you have the Federal Reserve that was created. That there's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. It's a consortium of international bankers, and there's nothing reserve. We're not backed by gold and silver anymore, so there's no reserve to the Federal Reserve. But there's a very interesting book. Girls, if you kind of understand the markets and you find that interesting, it's called The Creature of Jekyll Island. The Creature of Jekyll Island. And it talks about this secret meeting of some of the top bankers in America in 1910 to hatch this plan to come up with the Federal Reserve. And I will talk about this in just a moment. But if you want to really understand this, the Creature of Jekyll Island is a little island off of Georgia. And they went to a private resort at J.P. Morgan, a very wealthy banker at the time. And these men, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and people high up in government, had this secret meeting. And then we also set up the welfare state with Social Security, and we made the general welfare clause now mean specific welfare for whatever causes we begin to get involved, because now we had all this money because we had these federal income tax because of the 16th Amendment. And so obviously the majority of the problems we face in America have come about because we've abandoned some of these key checks and balances found in the Constitution. And it's really happened within the last 100 years. So let's just look at the attacks on the Constitution itself. The founders expected our beautiful, inspired document, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, to last forever. Remember, Thomas Jefferson said these principles were eternal, and it took him 17 days to write the Declaration of Independence. And 16 of those 17 days were just spent on the first two paragraphs, because he pulled these principles from Scripture, Deuteronomy, Exodus. And he said, I sense that these principles will be eternal, that it might carry us on into a millennial time. And so our James Madison said, we accomplished a revolution which has had no parallel in the annals of human society. They reared the fabrics of government which have no model on the face of the globe. They formed the design of a great confederacy, which it is incumbent on their successors to improve and to perpetuate. Now, girls, it's not like republics hadn't existed before. There had been ancient republics, the Republic of Rome. I mean, for heaven's sakes, China calls themselves the People's Republic of China. But when you really look up how they do the republic in China, it's described a Leninist, Marxist, socialist republic. And I just laughed when I saw that. This form of republic with the checks and balances and the branches of government, the vertical, horizontal checks and balances, horizontal and the vertical checks and balances is unique. There's never been a government like this formed. And so the founders knew the only way we could maintain it is if, first of all, number one, we interpret the Constitution precisely the way it was written. And number two, that any means of trying to change that Constitution would weaken or destroy those chains of the Constitution that were supposed to bind down the federal government so they didn't get too large and unwieldy like they had just come from in England. And so, you know, they acknowledged that we might need to tweak the Constitution from time to time. That's why they gave us the 5th article on how to amend the Constitution. But it's hard to amend the Constitution. It tells us you need 2/3 of Congress to agree on the amendment, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures have to approve it. So we don't really see many amendments. But what George Washington said, but you need to be careful that there's not a power grab through usurpation, usurping the power. And that's exactly what we're going to see as we go through this. George Washington said, "Let there be no change by usurpation for this Constitution, for surely it will destroy these free governments." And an example of a usurping power is like the president in the executive branch making law through executive order, because we're told in the Constitution that in order for laws to be made, it needs to go through the representatives who have been vetted, voted on by the people, not some president that just signs a quick executive order and it's made law. Or mandates. We mandate you to wear a mask or to, you know, do certain things. These are usurpations of power. And regulatory agency law is also another example of usurping power. So by the closing of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, we're clipping along here, girls, there was a massive attack on the relevance of the Constitution and the separation of powers. And many scholars and political philosophers were buying into this, that it was, you know, too cumbersome, too slow, we needed to change it. And even Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of Princeton University in the early 1900s, agreed with that. And isn't it interesting, under Woodrow Wilson, he resided as the president from 1913 to 1921. It was under that president that we got the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, and the formation of the Federal Reserve. And so, and then you started in the 1900s getting senators and members of Congress actually saying, for instance, Joseph Clark of Pennsylvania, Senator Clark said, "I have no hesitation in stating my deep conviction that the legislatures of America, local, state, and national, presently are the greatest menace to the successful operation of the democratic process. The executive should be strengthened at the expense of the legislature." So you have politicians that believe that, and we have problems. Another senator from Arkansas, Senator Fulbright, believed that the presidential power should be massively expanded. And he said, yeah, we should break out of this intellectual confine of the cherished and traditional beliefs and open our minds to the possibility that basic changes in our system must be essential to keep up with the times, kind of thing. And so in the 1900s, in the very beginning, in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt, who many of you might think he was a wonderful man, but he was really a progressive president. He actually says he thought he was entitled to do everything except that which the Constitution specifically said he could not do. And that is the opposite of what our founders felt. Remember, our founder said in Amendment 9 and 10, only limited and carefully defined powers to that federal government. And if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, then that means it's supposed to be solved at the state level. So Theodore Roosevelt kind of got that one wrong. And in fact, under him, we started this period of expansionism when we started to make our presence known in Panama and Canal, the Panama Canal, Cuba, and the Philippines, and Guam, and so forth. And even Supreme Court justices in the 1900s, look at Charles Hughes, said, hey, we are under a constitution, but as in the Supreme Court, the Constitution is what I deem it to be. So instead of guarding the law and sticking to the rule of law, they are now, their personal opinions, the whim of man is now going to start to take precedence here. And as they felt that this constitutional document in the early 1900s and beyond was starting to become irrelevant to our day. And so they were going to, and we're seeing that. We're seeing opinions based on popular trends and tides and sentiments of the day. And so even President Kennedy, kind of keeping with this theme here, where he said, there is some that feel by many good Americans that the American Constitution, which Gladstone called, and Gladstone was a British prime minister in the late 1800s, who even he knew that there was something really special and powerful about our Constitution. Even Gladstone calls it the most notable work ever struck off by the minds of man, gives us the automatic light to the future, or guides clear our way, and all we have to do is follow the very clear precepts it lays down. After all, the Constitution was written, though, for an entirely different period in our nation's history. It was written under an entirely different country and conditions. So in other words, he's saying, look, it just doesn't fit for the conditions of our day. Although, remember in Seminar 1, we talked about John Adams, who was one of the founding fathers, second president of our country. He said that they wrote this Constitution and that it would apply through all the ages because it addresses human nature, and human nature never changes. He said this Constitution was written to govern 3 million people at the time they wrote the Constitution. That's what the population was, 3 million in the United States. He said it was written to govern up to 300 million, and we are at 320 million. So what he's saying is this Constitution was meant to be enduring regardless of the size of the population. So there has been a specific attack on our founders in the last 100 years, and it's filtered through our educational systems. And remember, our little founders pledged in the Declaration their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honors. And their honors, there has been a number done on their honors as we have made them to be racist, hypocrite, perverts. Ben Franklin, a womanizer. He was known as the father of morality. Did you know that? The golden patriot. George Washington, he was a racist. He was ornery. He had a sour personality. Thomas Jefferson, he had lots of illegitimate children with Sally Hemings. There's been a real attack in the last 100 years on our founders, because when you can attack personalities, you're less inclined to study what they gave us. You're less inclined to study the Constitution when you think that they were dirty dog, racists, perverts, hypocrites, that kind of thing. And so there's been a specific campaign. In fact, over $1 billion I think over the last 100 years have been spent on attacking their reputation and their characters and the Constitution. And there's a book called The Tax-Exempt Foundations. And actually, let me tell you, so people in the early 1950s began to know that there was some kind of force on hand that was undermining our founders and our Constitution. And so the question was asked, who is responsible for all this undermining of our country, our founders, these principles? And so there was actually several private foundations that were brought to light that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in tax-exempt funds to promote textbooks and teachings that were socialistic and kind of highlighting a one world in foreign affairs. So because the public kind of got caught wind of this, in 1952, Congress actually passed a resolution and set up a special committee to investigate these tax-exempt foundations. These tax-exempt foundations are products of wealthy people that wanted to shield some of their money. And that was the Fords, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and those likes. There's a very interesting book called Tax Exempt Foundations, and it spells out how they use their monies to shape the narratives of changing this country. They wanted the 16th and the 17th Amendment because it was self-serving for their own purposes. They didn't like the slow, deliberate nature of the House and the Senate, and it just took too long. So, and they couldn't buy off the senators because the senators were beholden to states. And so you can get this from kimbercurriculum.com, Tax Exempt Foundations. It's a very fascinating, not a difficult read at all. Put that on your list of potential books you might want to read. And so sure enough, they found when they studied this, Congressman Reese headed up this committee to investigate. And they determined that these foundations and organizations were using their resources for un-American and subversive activities for political purposes, propaganda, and attempts to influence legislation. And so we will see how some of the balance of power was destroyed when we passed the 17th Amendment. Remember in the first article of the Constitution, it said that our state senators, not state, but our federal senators should be chosen by the legislature for a 6-year term. Now, the founders wanted this because they wanted the Senate to be responsible to represent the states as sovereign entities. This is why they had the state legislature appoint them and not the people. They only wanted the people to appoint the House members who serve for 2 years. The senators would then not be as compelled to involve themselves in popular issues of the day, but really primarily focus on protecting the states' rights and maintaining that order, coming home every weekend and presenting the bills that are on the docket in DC and talking to their state legislatures and asking, look, is our state interested in supporting this bill? Can we afford it? Does it infringe upon the rights of our state? And then they would counsel with the state legislature. And so they were beholden to what the state legislature and the people were wanting for that state. And so instead, when the 17th Amendment was passed, it meant no longer did the senators were they elected by the state legislature, but they were elected by the people. So remember that three-headed eagle in one of our seminars, the one eagle was the wing of compassion. And that's what our House members were. They're only in every 2 years. So they really want to solve problems quick. They want to get the money and take it home and solve it. So the people will go, oh yeah, he's good. We want to re-elect him. So now the senators, instead of being the wing of resource, wait a minute, is this necessary? Does this violate our rights? Are we going to pay for a program that another state is going to benefit from? So instead of, them doing that, they felt the need to get as much money as they can and solve problems, because ultimately it was going to be the people that was not only going to reelect the House members, but now the senators as well. George Washington knew that this would disrupt the balance of power. He was the biggest proponent of the senators being elected by the state legislature, because the senators were supposed to kind of be on be aware of radical movements that might break down property rights or states' rights. And so they would be that kind of that wall of protection between the federal government protecting their state. And so, but, when the Civil War happens, follow me, when the Civil War occurred in the mid-1860s, we became distracted again. War distracts people. And instead of being so tied to our local loyalties, we kind of abandoned those to favor more of a central government, because North and South. And so after the reconstruction of the Civil War, it kind of eroded a little bit of the concept of sovereignty of states. And then there was this real populist movement now from these master planners, these oil and railroad and banking, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan's. They wanted to be able to access the senators and to buy them off, so to speak. And so what happened to change the minds, the public opinion, and accept, a 17th Amendment was there was a scandal in Chicago that a senator had actually bought his way, had bribed the legislature in Illinois. And so that was just the impetus to, try and convince people that instead of correcting the problem, let's just get rid of the problem. And I always tell my children, it's like, if your oven is broke, well, we fix it. We don't just stop using the oven and switch to doing everything in a toaster oven. We need the oven. The oven is essential to a great kitchen. And they got rid of the oven and started the toaster, if you're following my analogy there. And so we saw a breakdown in that governmental machine that the founders intended, the checks and balances of someone's representing and protecting the state now. And so it also, when the senators knew that the people were reelecting them, I told you it cost, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, it cost $16 million to run for re-election or election for the Senate. So senators, the first time they're elected by the people, but every time they're reelected, they're elected by special interest, big money. And so they are now more beholden to special interests than they are to even the people in their states. And so that's another disruption of the check and balance and the separation of powers because of that 17th Amendment and people electing our senators now instead of the state legislature. So girls, I'm not going to lie to you. It took me a while to really figure out the 16th and 17th Amendment and how disruptive it was to our government. And so just mull on that. If you're not quite fully understanding it, keep reading and keep studying. But know that when we come to heal America, something is going to have to be done about that 16th and 17th Amendment. And what it also did is it made members of Congress have actually confessed that lobbyists actually have greater influence with members of Congress, our senators and our House members, than citizens do now. Because senators know it takes $16 million to get back in office. I need PAC money from big companies. My husband was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. the first 10 years of his career. And he said, Julini, and he worked for a very large company that wrote very big checks to members of Congress. And he said, it's a shame, but I could walk into any congressional office and I knew all the chiefs of staff. I could almost walk into any member of Congress's office and they would see me because they knew I usually came with money. He said, I knew them so well, I'd walk into their office and I knew exactly where they hid their candy and their stashes of goodies. And so that's a shame. And this is one of the byproducts of that 17th Amendment. And also members of Congress have admitted as well to being influenced by what the media is telling them. All you have to do, instead of what their constituents in their states are wanting, all you have to do is look at the 7 senators who voted to remove Trump, Republican senators to remove Trump from office. Out of those 7 senators, I doubt they were going back home and consulting with their constituents, because I believe it's 5 of those senators are not running for re-election. And 2 of them, I know Mitt Romney from Utah, the people in Utah are not happy with him. He did not represent the sentiment and feelings of their state. And so as senators have gotten used to not going home and checking with their state legislatures, they've become more beholden to the popular trends on, in the media and the big money from the special interest groups. Okay, moving on. Are you with me, girls? I always feel like I'm going a mile a minute. I'm trying to teach 2 hours worth of material in an hour, but hopefully you've read the material, so you're following with me, or you will be so inspired to go back and want to reread it, really figure out what in the world I've been saying.
Yeah.
So we're now on the assault on the founder's concept of the executive. So I hope you've had a chance to watch that 13-minute video, YouTube it, the most powerful office in the world. I think that's what it's called. And our founders intended to really limit that executive branch because they knew a kingly government looked like. That's why they broke away from England. And James Madison again said, only limited and carefully defined powers to the federal government. But they did know that, still his weight would be heavy. They had 6 things they wanted the president to do in the Constitution in that Article 2, to be the chief over 300 million Americans, be chief of state. There's 320 million Americans now. That's the population of the US right now. To be chief of state, to be commander over our military of 3 million, to be the chief executive officer of the executive branch of the government, okay? So there are regulatory agencies that he kind of oversees there. And we have way more regulatory agencies than the founder intended. We have almost 500 regulatory agencies. Good luck keeping track of all those, President Biden. And then he is to be the chief architect for needed federal legislation. That doesn't mean legislate by executive order. That means if you feel like there needs to be a law, you find some sponsors in the Senate and the House, and you can lobby them, but you go through the proper procedure of the legislative branch making laws. The executive branch was supposed to enforce laws, the legislative makes laws, and the judicial guards the laws. That's what they're intended to do. And I skipped over, he should be the chief diplomat in handling foreign relations. Now, I don't know, girls, if you watched the press conference last week, the very first press conference that Joe Biden had, but he stuck very close to his notes. In particular, he almost read verbatim when there was questions about foreign affairs. And it made me wonder how much of a grasp and understanding he has, because this is one of his prime responsibility is to handle foreign relations. And also, lastly, to grant pardons and reprieves. And that's always controversial, but that is in their right. They have every right to grant pardons and reprieves. So not only has the presidential powers been expanded from these six duties, but they've been expanded by outright usurpation, because guess what? Congress has really abdicated some of their responsibility over to the executive branch through the 16th and the 17th Amendment. And our founders knew this would be a formula for tyranny if our executive branch were to expand, and this is a problem. So one of the most serious violations of that executive branch is these 500 regulatory agencies and their ability to make a regulatory law. Our Constitution says that all legislative powers must be vetted by or must be done by representatives who have been vetted, voted on by the people. So all these regulatory laws have not been vetted on by voted in people. It's just, bureaucrats making up these laws. So these highly restrictive regulatory laws have been a violation of what the founders intended. You have, the IRS and the FCC and the EPA and OSHA. OSHA can come in and shut down a business just like that because they're not abiding by, OSHA laws. And so, and not to mention executive orders. Oh my goodness. Really in the 1900s, it's like the presidents all began to wake up to this idea that if it's an emergency, I can just write an executive order and make it law. President Clinton signed 364 executive orders in 8 years. President Bush, 291 in 8 years. I think I said Clinton was 6 years, 8 years. 8 years for Bush. 8 years for Obama, he signed 276 executive orders. Trump, 220 executive orders in 4 years. Not good. And Biden in 10 weeks has signed over 50 executive orders. And he's actually said he's going to sign another executive order in regards to gun control based on the mass shootings we've seen the last few weeks. That is completely contrary to what our founders said. And in fact, the Supreme Court has, jumped on this bandwagon as well. And in the last several decades, have usurped power from the legislative branch, and they have made laws. It's called judicial legislation. They said when it was necessary because it was in the public interest or public convenience to do so. And in some cases, the courts have said that it was needed for public necessity that we make laws from the bench. I do think it's interesting how they did not think, the Supreme Court did not think it was in the best interest of our country to hear any of the election fraud cases that were put before them. So you can see when they no longer, are thinking about protecting the law, but now making law, and they're not basing their law on the rule of law, but on the whims of man, on public opinion, because times have changed. We have some of the problems that we're seeing today in the executive and in the courts. So before long, there were more executive orders, administrative laws, judicial legislation issued as federal law than those that were being passed by Congress. And that's a real problem because Congress are supposed to be the only ones that make law. So can you see we have now a disruption of the separation of powers? They're spilling in to the legislative branch. And so now we see a president who has been heaped upon him a huge host of responsibilities that are outside of those 16 or those 6 duties. He's now in charge of agriculture, the Department of Agriculture, housing, energy, labor disputes, welfare, Social Security, law enforcement, energy, steel, automobile, regulating these major US industries, monitoring the internet, radio, TV, Food and Drug Administration. Can you see how corruption, he can't possibly do everything that we have given him the power to do in these agencies. And we're starting to see a runaway executive branch created because a lot of why the legislative branch has just abdicated their responsibilities to the executive branch. And maybe it might be because they don't want to make those hard decisions anymore because the Senate, the senators have to be reelected just like that House members. And so they want to do things that are popular. They want to bring the goodies home, all the tax money that they've been taxed with. They want to take some of that money and provide programs and get real tax. Then you spend, and that's how you get reelected. And because the senators aren't on that wall representing the states anymore, they're wanting maybe some of these harder things to be thrown over thrown over to the executive branch. And we're also seeing US presidents are participating internationally in summit conferences. Now, the Constitution says that we can't make any commitments with foreign powers unless the Senate approves, they're called treaties, unless 2/3 of the Senate approves the treaty. But the presidents in the last 100 years have been getting around this by entering into international trade agreements, and the Senate has no jurisdiction to have to, approve those. Remember in 2012 when President Obama was caught on a hot mic and he was talking to the president of Russia and he said, after the elections, I'm going to have more flexibility, just be patient. And he didn't realize there was a mic that picked up that. So this is what I'm talking about. Presidents are not supposed to do side deals. They're supposed to make agreements through treaties, come back, have the Senate check the president to make sure, yeah, that's what our country wants. And so presidents have usurped, been a power grab, by using these international trade agreements. Remember Lord Acton? He's an English historian in the 19th century. He said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is kind of what we're seeing with our executive branch. So we see that there is also an assault on the Supreme Court. Our little judges for several generations tried to stay true to the wisdom of the founders, but then they increasingly have started to move away from our Constitution. Just as Thomas Jefferson, and he talks about this in The Making of America, how actually all the founders were worried that they didn't put enough checks on the courts. And what we're seeing now is, I'm running out of time, but the Supreme Court has usurped authority from the states by using the 14th Amendment. That equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment is the very thing they use to legalize gay marriage, the Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment was meant to punish Southern states that were not going to abolish slavery. Okay, so the 14th Amendment is a part of the 13th, 14th, and 15th that were put in the Constitution right after the Civil War to ensure that slavery is abolished, that they have the same citizen rights in the 14th Amendment, equal protection of law, the slaves. But now the courts are actually using that to punish the states. If certain states pass gay marriage and other states don't recognize gay marriage, that's not very fair for the two men that have been married, because their marriage is not acknowledged in states. That's not an equal protection of their rights in those states. And so they actually use that equal protection clause to justify passing a national case legalizing gay marriage. So when you understand what our founders meant by that equal protection clause and how it's being twisted today by the courts, you can see that that's a misinterpretation and distortion of that 14th Amendment. And so you have all kind of examples of justices saying, hey, we are under a constitution, but the Constitution is what we, the judges, say it is. And so go ahead and read that assault on the Supreme Court and the 4 steps that kind of gradually drew us away from the founding fathers' opinions and the Constitution and the Federalist Papers to what we have now is a virtually out of control judiciary. And we talk about that in Seminar 4, about how we can rein the Supreme Court in. So we're coming to the end, so hang in there. There was an assault on America's monetary system. Remember, in the Constitution, the very first article, it said that we were to coin money, set the value, and it was supposed to be backed by gold and silver. But when these men, these international and American bankers got together, the story is so interesting. 3 years before the Federal Reserve was created, they held this secret meeting, and they didn't want anyone to know they were meeting because it would get the attention of America up. And so they drafted this secret meeting in the private resort at J.P. Morgan. The reason for secrecy was simple. Had it been known that rival factions, so these were all rival businessmen, if these rivals were getting together and the banking community had joined together, the public would have been alerted to the possibility that they were plotting something nefarious. And in fact, that's exactly what they were doing. What emerged from this secret meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910 was a cartel agreement with 5 objectives: to stop the growing competition from the nation's newer banks, obtain a franchise to create money out of nothing, fiat money, take us off the gold and silver standard for the purpose of lending more money, and to get control of all the reserves of all the banks so that the more reckless ones would not be exposed to currency drains and bank runs, and get the taxpayer to pick up the cartel's inevitable losses and convince Congress that the purpose was to really protect the Congress or protect the public. And so when we went off the golden standard, when we created the Federal Reserve in 1913, it meant that these banks could loan out more money at a greater rate, because now it was fiat money. It was phony money. It wasn't backed by anything. So these banks, these private banks could inflate or deflate the dollar by controlling interest rates. So they could lower the rates, which would cause us all to want to buy houses. Oh, interest rate is at 0%. I mean, just think of the last few years. We all want to buy. And then they raise the rates and they call in loans and they bust people because now people, all the interest rates are up everywhere and people are in over their heads. And so they call in your loan, you declare bankruptcy or you turn your house back to the bank and they make money so they can create these boom and bust. So they boom, everything's booming, everything's popping, everyone's buying. And then they raise the rates and everyone busts and they make their money. So can you see how these international bankers were very self-serving when they created this Federal Reserve and took us and convinced, Woodrow Wilson was in on this and convinced members of Congress that this was a good thing. And so that was the assault on our monetary system. There was an assault on our commerce system. In the Constitution, the southern states weren't, sharing their cotton and their tobacco with the northern states because they were mad at them. So the Commerce Clause in the first article says, hey, well, we'll be involved in commerce, but we'll just make sure that, the proper transportation of goods and services are available to all states. But what happened in the 1900s is this Commerce Clause, they began to get involved within the dealings, within the states, and began to get involved with labor disputes and price fixing. And then you see recently Obamacare. He was forcing, the government was telling everyone they had to buy this insurance. Or look at the mask mandates on businesses. You have to have people wear masks or you will shut down your business and you can only operate at 25% capacity. And even the vaccine mandates, you cannot travel if you don't have a vaccine. You cannot go to sporting events if you don't have proof. So they are getting involved within the commerce of our country when they were only supposed to be involved amongst, not within. And so, girls, I hope you can see from the last three sections of Seminar 3, the attacks on the Constitution, the attacks on our founding fathers are real. And with some of these amendments, the 16th and 17th, even the 14th Amendment that's been misconstrued, there's been a destruction of the balance of powers in our government. And there's been an assault on the concept of our founder, what they intended for the executive branch, and an assault on what the founders intended for the Supreme Court, and an assault on our monetary system with the Federal Reserve and our commerce. Now, girls, we don't go through these things so, once again, go get the tub of ice cream and go, we're going to heck in a handbag or even use stronger language. But we do this so that we can appreciate how to heal. And we will talk about this in Seminar 4. I always say this: God did not establish this first free society in modern times to have it collapse into oblivion. He promised us that he will heal our land in 2 Chronicles 7:14 if we will repent and turn to him and seek his face. And it will be mamas, I promise you, it will be the mothers of America that wake up their husbands, that wake up their children and their grandchildren. And it will justify the heavens to intervene. This is why it's so important we stay anchored in hope, that we know we're realists. We know the deal. We know how America was established. We understand the basic premise of the Constitution. We know the devious minds that have attacked this country, and we know ideas and solutions how to heal it. And we can put politicians' feet to the fire when we're steeped in principle. And it helps us to stay anchored in hope because now we're part of the solution. We're learning, we're asking questions, we're getting involved. I would be remiss, girls, if I didn't say that, because of Jesus Christ, we're about to celebrate Easter on Sunday. And Easter is about peace and hope. It's about that peace that passes all understanding that it talks about in Philippians. It's kind of like being in the eye of the storm, even though there's just craziness going on around us, we are anchored. We are anchored in peace and in hope. Because of him, we don't have to go this alone. Even death isn't an end. We celebrate resurrection with Easter. So we were in Nashville last Sunday for Palm Sundays, and me and three of the other moms. So we didn't go to church, but it made me think I wanted to be there with my palms, my palm fronds. Some churches pass out palms and wave them on Palm Sunday. But it reminds me of that scripture in Isaiah that God has engraven you in the palm of his hand. And he doesn't say us, he says you. It's singular. He knows you. He knows me. As we stay rooted in God and we keep praying to him. Last week, one of the mamas emailed me after class and she said, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm a little discouraged about what I'm learning. And she said, maybe the only thing I can do, are you there with me today? She said, maybe the only thing I can do is pray. And I said, amen, sister. Do not stop praying morning and night. Gather with your children. Gather with your husband. I think that's probably what's kept me and my husband together in 30 years is that every night we kneel next to each other and we pray. And sometimes I don't even think I like him at the moment, but we pray. And it softens hearts and it causes us to cleave together and to be strong. So you pray with those kiddies, you pray with those grandchildren, you keep that family close. Yesterday, I spoke to my kids for 3 hours on the phone. 4 of my 5 kids are out of my house. I talked 2 hours to one girl who's getting ready to go to law school. She just wanted to talk. And she eventually asked me about what I was doing. And then I talked to an hour to my basketball boy in Detroit. And they all wanted to know, how was Nashville? And I told them, girls, I told them about you and my class and the things I'm learning. And they just listened. They listened to the example of what Mama is doing for country, for freedom, for God. This basketball boy, I couldn't get him to read a book to save his life. And he was telling me yesterday the books that he's reading on how to win friends and influence people, Dale Carnegie and on Abraham Lincoln. And I'm like, do miracles cease to exist? So keep those kids close because they might say ridiculous things. This is the kid who voted for Kanye West. My daughter was threatening to vote for, Biden. And I was like, oh, my land, when you want to kill these kids, just keep them close and love on them and be patient with them. They will come around, I promise you. And then keep learning. I am so proud of you girls. You are learning. We are learning the Constitution and our history from the viewpoint of our founders that made it great. And as we continue to do these things, God will let you know what to do. He's already letting you know. You keep showing up each week because the Spirit is pressing upon your heart. And eventually he might whisper, try doing this with your children or your grands, try do this, or opportunities will present themselves and you will be anchored in hope. And you will become a light and a beacon, and you won't be emotional and hysterical from watching the news. You'll be maybe slightly disgusted, but you will know, you will have some ideas and suggestions for those around you. And so this is what we do in our online cottage meetings. And it's what you do if you gather 3 or 4 girls eventually and decide to meet in your home. It's empowering. It's transformative. These cottage meetings, honestly, have changed my life. They changed my marriage. They changed my kids, the way I teach them. And so just stick with it. Don't get too overwhelmed. You're here and you're on the wall and you're saying, Lord, here am I. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with what I'm learning now, but I'm trying and I'm willing. And you just watch how the Lord goes to town with you, Mama. So anyways, we have one more week of assaults and attacks on internationally, how we've gotten involved when we really, that's not what our founders intended. And then we start talking about some solutions. And I love those solutions because that's what we want to be. We don't want to be a part of the problem. We want to be a part of the solution. So we will have a beautiful Easter, girls, and we will see you next week. I'm going to be in Puerto Rico next week. but I'm taking my books and I'm gonna, if you're dedicated and willing to show up, I'm willing to teach. So the show will go on. Some of you, it might be spring break. If for some reason you can't hear the class, remember, you can always go back and watch it online on our website. Take care, and we will see you next week. Don't eat too many chocolate bunnies.